Good to see you. We had
Hello.
a link issue.
Welcome to our first Impact Hour, Communicating for Climate Action with Per Espen Stoknes, facilitated by Mark Shapiro. I'm Lauren Lavitt, the Development Manager for the Human Impacts Institute.
And I'm Nellie Vandriska, Communications Intern here at the Human Impacts Institute. If you have a question, you're free to ask it at any time, but we will wait to answer until the Q&A session starts. To ask a question, go to the grid at the top right-hand corner of your page. It's next to a circle with a question mark in it. There's a box with a bunch of little boxes, and if you click that, you'll be directed to the Q&A section where you will be able to type your question into the box and hit send.
The Human Impacts Institute uses creative approaches to inspire people to take action on the most important environmental issues of our time. Our mission is to inspire you to transform environmental challenges into social action for a just and livable world. We will be doing a series of Impacts Hours over the coming months and hope you will continue to join us. Impacts Hours are curated conversations where inspiring people share their knowledge, ideas, stories, and solutions in a beautiful and engaging ways. We'd like to thank Invoking the Pause, an environmental small grants program, for supporting the series. Our facilitator today for Impacts Hour is Mark Shapiro, an award-winning investigative journalist who explores the intersection between the environment, economics, and international political power. His writing appears in Harper's, The Atlantic, Yale Environment 360, The Nation, and other publications. His most recent book, Carbon Shock, A Tale of Risk and Calculus on the Front Lines of the Disrupted Global Economy, reports from environmental tension zones around the world where the costs of climate change are being experienced and fought. His previous book was Exposed, The Toxic Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. He is an adjunct professor at Military Institute of International Studies at Monterey and lecturer at UC Berkeley Grad School of Journalism. He was formerly a senior correspondent at the Center for Investigative Reporting. And Mark, it's on to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Human Impacts Institute, for putting together this incredible kind of transnational conversation here. Quickly, just a few very brief words about what kind of motivated me to invite Per Espen onto this series that Human Impacts is putting together. You know, I'm a journalist. I have training in investigative reporting, and that's kind of what I've been pursuing over years and years, including into climate change, and I wrote I wrote this book, Carbon Shock, which, as Lauren said, was about the hidden economic costs of fossil fuels. And between the process of writing Carbon Shock and then issuing a paperback version of that book, which is called The End of Stationarity, Searching for the New Normal in the Age of Carbon Shock, just got in paperback about 2 weeks ago. I read Per Espen's book between those two, and I have to say it was actually extremely influential to read his book, because it actually told us a lot about the way to tell and understand the stories about climate change. And it certainly influenced the way that I kind of revised and updated Carbon Shock, and actually gave it this notion of searching for a new normal in the age of carbon shock, meaning with the word engage in a constant tension to find this new equilibrium in this era of climate disruption. So that said, I think the fundamental thing that he has understood and addresses is that we know who the bad guys are, and that's my training, is understanding who are the bad guys, following the trail, figuring out who the villains are. We know who's responsible for climate change. We can actually name them. We know the addresses of the fossil fuel companies. We know it has to be done, and yet very little is actually, or actually it might be changing. We can talk to Per Espen about that. But we've had a struggle in terms of getting traction, even with the knowledge of what's happening. So I've appreciated very much Mr. Stoknes' approach to changing this narrative, which has already begun to influence mine, I think other people's reporting. So Mr. Stoknes, quickly to him, has an almost perfect storm of skills that he brings to this climate debate. He's an economist, a psychologist, with degrees in philosophy and economic theory. Pretty great combination of forces. He's also worked with large companies in marketing and positioning companies for the green economy. So he understands human psychology, economics, and the importance of shifting away from fossil fuels and the stories we need to start telling ourselves. So with that, I will turn it on to Mr. Per Espen Stoknes in Norway, talking to us live from Norway. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Great. Thanks also for the warm words. Great being with you from a mountain cabin up in the forest in Norway. I hope the connection will work out all right. If not, Mark, you must wave or something to me, all right?
I'll do that. I'll nudge you from afar.
Yeah. There's something a little bit challenging with the app here, but I hope it will work out right, because I'll now try to share my screen and show you the front page of a few slides. So if this is working now, you can able to see the front page of my book, what we think about when we try not to think about global warming. The reason for this was that over the last 25 years I've been following the climate debate. It started out really with my interest in eco-philosophy and deep ecology up in Norway with Norwegian mountains with Arne Næss, and also being a psychologist I was frustrated about the way climate was communicated. The question that's been really driving me over these years is the question, are humans inevitably short-term? And scientists and quite a few economists and cultural commentators have been more or less implying that we want to have all our cake now and don't care much about the future. So my research has been looking into what does it take really for people to act in the long term, because climate change is the quintessential problem of restraining or changing now in order to get a very much delayed benefit far into the future. So it seems to be a kind of key challenge really to the human psychology to be able to deal with climate change in any constructive way. So what I did was that back in 2009 and 10, I started reviewing all the published literature on this. The presentation I'm going to show you is it's not about the climate science, such as this one with the famous RCP scenarios and the 4-degree warmer world in 2100, but it's really about the psychology of this graph, or the psychology of climate science. Not the climate science as such, but how people respond to the climate science. Because there is a huge paradox, psychological climate paradox, as I call it, which is that as we've had climate communications like this graph and with images of a warming world, of smelting ice, drowning polar bears, etc., the engagement of people have actually been going down. So it seems that, as this shows here, the US responses to the question, how much do you personally worry about the greenhouse effect or global warming? As you can see, in 1989, it was higher than just now recently, 2016. First time 2016 has been going up. And in Norway, it's even more prevalent that it seems that the stronger the climate science has become, the less people care or worry or get concerned about climate change. And on an international level, it seems to be particular to Western, wealthier, and English-speaking democracies. As you can see here, the international responses to the question, the climate change we're currently seeing is largely the result of human activity. Well, China agrees, and southern countries such as Argentina, Italy, Spain, India, Brazil have come out very clearly on this, but at the bottom we find countries such as Australia, Great Britain, and the US. So the question I really tried to look into was how can it be that with more scientific certainty we get a declining concern over time? And one could question whether this probably is the greatest science communication failure in history, in the sense that billions of dollars have been gone into climate change, and thousands of articles have been published in the media and in the academic journals, and yet we see, for instance, in the OECD countries, that most public think the climate scientists still disagree on global warming, while in reality more than 97% of climate scientists do agree. So in order to explain this, in the book, what we think about when we try not to think about global warming, I outlined what I saw as the main 5 defenses that stop people from taking into their heart the climate science messages. 5 barriers, so to speak, that really make climate kind of just deflect from their self-understanding, and then also 5 main solutions that are evidence-based, described in the literature. And I wanted to kind of just briefly walk you through this, these 5 barriers, and then the 5 solutions, and then we'll open up for the discussion. So in order to make this vast literature now available, there, it looks like I lost the connection a little bit. So yeah, in order to make, can you hear me now?
Yeah, this is better.
Good, good. Was I away for a long time, or was it just a short interview?
I think you dropped off for about 10 seconds, and then you're back now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So I've simplified this about 300, 400 articles down to the 5 main barriers, and made this model to kind of see how we could make it into one condensed image. And it seems the literature points to these 5 barriers as the distance barrier, the doom barrier, the dissonance barrier, denial barrier, and identity barrier. So if there is a climate message, such as, oh, we've now passed 400 ppms in the atmosphere, or now the Antarctic ice shelf has started to a self-perpetuating meltdown, and it will certainly increase ocean levels by 2 meters in 200 years. All these kind of messages just don't get into the heart of most people. So how can distance be a barrier? To show this, again with the graph, typically climate has been positioned far out in time, and that's still pretty prevalent in the science discourse. One speaks about 2050 and 2100, and when you use that timeline, it's way beyond, of course, people's main or everyday attention span. So, I mean, most of us have our minds and attention filled with the to-dos of the coming 2 weeks, not the 2 centuries. Also, in climate science, there's been, and in media, there's been a tendency to use always images of glaciers, Arctic and Antarctica, and penguins and polar bears, or even maybe sometimes Pacific cyclones. And droughts happening in India or somewhere else. So it communicates inadvertently that climate is something far away from me, not just in time, but also it's happening somewhere else. So it's not now, it's not here, and also it's not really about me. It's about, like this picture shows, from the Haiyan cyclone in the Philippines, that it affects people that I don't know. I don't know anybody who knows them. And psychology has been documented again and again that if we get the more links there are between myself and somebody who's afflicted and suffering, the less empathy. So the social distance is core to triggering our engagement and empathy. So that's why, for instance, one image of a 3-year-old Syrian refugee child dying on the beach has more impact than her learning about 1 million people displaced. And finally, it's also communicated in the sense that climate change is the responsibility of somebody else. It's the global negotiations, it's international leaders, it's corporative executives, big guys that I don't have any possibility to influence, speaking about me or I as the typical recipient of the climate message. So it's perceived as something I can't do much about. It's about them, it's about these decision makers, it's not about me. So all this gets back to the psychological distancing phenomenon that has been well documented, that we have low feelings of personal risk, and it makes the climate seem of low urgency and low issue priority. So one problem with the climate issue is that if you rank it against other issues, the economy, immigration, criminality, terrorism comes up much higher than the climate, and it ends up on the 14th or 15th out of 15 items typically. So what about doom barrier? Let's say that a climate communicator starts to talk about climate as here, it's happening now, we can see the effects, it's hitting our economy today. Is that sufficient? Well, the problem is that if you get past or above the distance barrier, you typically hit against the doom barrier. And the doom barrier is a mental frame, a psychological frame, where we hear that catastrophe is imminent. It's apocalypse, so to speak. But after hearing about that for 25 years, we've habituated, we start to avoid it, and we have what I would call apocalypse fatigue, in the sense that we just can't take more of this total doom atmosphere in. So my inner emotional resources to get worried and concerned and engage is kind of exhausted. And finally, the unintended by consequence of this is that you start to stereotype the messengers. So for instance, like in this Photoshop, here you can see the cartoon, sorry, but the quintessential environmental lady coming out there, save the planet, go kill yourself. So these environmentalists are all just doomsday prophets, and they've always been wrong, and they will be wrong in the future. So that's the way the doom barrier generates backlash on the climate messaging by overuse of that catastrophe frame. One study by the Oxford Institute of Journalism found that more than 80% of all news media articles had employed the catastrophe framing. More than 80%. So that kind of contributes to that kind of fatigue we're seeing. So if we pass the doom barrier by using more constructive frames, there is still a dissonance barrier. That's the one that comes up next. So what's the dissonance? Well, that's between what we know and how we behave in everyday life. So if I live an ordinary life based on technologies from the previous century, I drive a petrol car, I go with a plane, I live in a building that uses quite a bit of energy, I'm forced into a lifestyle in which there is a constant conflict or dissonance between my new knowledge and my daily lifestyle. And in this situation where we have that conflict, we immediately start to reduce it, because dissonance is uncomfortable. So in this simple graph, I've shown what happens internally in our minds when we suffer the dissonance. And that is, let's say I'm aware that I have high emissions, and I also know that CO2 leads to climate chaos. At least that's what the scientists are telling me. Now, this graph actually, or these connections you see here, actually comes from research on smoking, because within the smoking area, we have psychology has published like 7,000 or 8,000 articles on studying the attitudes of smoking. And what they found is that if I'm smoking, and smoking leads to cancer, these are the two contradictory cognitions, then there's a dissonance, and this dissonance tends to be explained away by one of these four strategies or internal self-justifications that we typically employ. So our brain has this fantastic capacity of self-justifying whatever we're up to, and particularly when we're in dissonance. So if I modify one or both of these cognitions, I can say, well, you know, it's not that I smoke so much really, or I can say a similar way that my emissions are really quite small. The problem isn't my emissions, but it is my neighbor. He has a bigger SUV than I have. Or it's not us, it's the Chinese, or it's the Indians. They are the ones that have the problem. So I can feel better about myself. If I do this, the dissonance is somehow relieved, somewhat relieved. And then comes an interesting one. It can change the importance of one. I don't have to modify it. I can just say, well, you know, they say that CO2 changes the climate, but hasn't climate always changed? Wasn't there a ice age some 1,000 years ago, and humans weren't around to stop that one? So if climate is always changing, then it can't be that important. If I do that, the immediate benefit is that my psychological dissonance is reduced, so I can feel better about myself. So if I'm there with filling my gas guzzler with more gas, and I start to think about the connection between the gas combustion and the climate change, I feel bad about myself doing that. Or when I'm out flying, for instance. So if I can remember that there is somebody saying that climate has always changed, then suddenly it takes my dissonance away and I feel better. So this is, so to speak, the demand side of doubt for climate. That's why contrarians often have an easy job in selling their contrarian message, because if people in general believe it, then they can start to feel better about themselves. While the problem with the climate science message is that it generates more dissonance. So climate scientists telling the truth makes people feel uncomfortable about their own behavior. And when in doubt about whether my behavior or my knowledge should influence my attitude, psychology knows that if there is conflict between behavior and cognition, behavior wins. So behavior drives the attitude. So if I'm locked into a high carbon lifestyle with cars and planes and meat and buildings that use a lot of energy, then this current behavior will guarantee a backlash in terms of the attitudes to supporting climate policies. Fourth barrier is the denial barrier. And of course, denial as a word has been used a bit too much, I think, in the climate communication community and among climate scientists. Denial is actually a word from depth psychology and Freudian psychology, which does not just point to a state in which we say no or ignore or negate what's being said, but it actually relates to a state of mind where we both know something and then live as if we do not know it at the same time. So also it has a social dimension. Typically it runs in a family or in a company or a community, that there's an agreement that we don't talk about the alcohol problems of this uncle, we don't talk about this sexual abuse, we don't talk about the atrocities that we know about happening to other people. So because if we do, then this makes everybody feel bad. So in the same way, of course, we have a huge climate denial, but it's not in the sense of a pejorative that we should throw at the other people that they are the denialists. Rather, it is about this state of both knowing and not knowing at the same time. That's why I prefer the word resistance to denial often. We all have a certain level of resistance in taking in the full ramifications of what we're doing to the climate and the planet at this point. Okay, finally, there is the identity barrier. So there's been a lot of research on this. Of course, there is the Yale research on the 6 segments of the public, how we have the alarmed people here and the dismissive people here. And you can see it typically when it comes to such a powerful symbol as the car. So, you know, the car industry knows that cars express identity. They sell identity. They don't sell a function of getting to A to B. So if I like, let's say, this car here, might go along with values, saying that I like big cars and small government. Well, some people over here prefer smaller cars and a little bit larger government. And you can see this playing out in the conflict of people feeling personally threatened or personally challenged by electric cars coming out. And Dan Kahane at Yale has done some great research in teasing out how the values overrides the facts in this case, in the sense that the more ordinary science intelligence people have, in general, they get the answer right on the question of, is the Earth getting warmer? A, mostly because of human activity, such as burning fossil fuels, or B, mostly because of natural patterns in the Earth's environment. And of course, A here is the right answer. However, if you split this according to values, people with conservative values and the Republican adherents tend to get it more wrong the more science intelligence they have. And this can only be understood if we understand that we tend to defend our identity with the intelligence and creativity we have. So if the facts don't match my values, I will use my intelligence to explain away the facts, so my identity is protected. So how do we move around this? Well, there's a need for a new climate communication toolbox, and the good news is that we do know quite a bit of what makes people care for the long term in terms of climate, how to motivate people for climate change behaviors in everyday life. And I summarized that in 5 main strategies or solutions, starting with S. So I call it the social strategy: make climate a social issue, make it simple to act, so we can use nudging and simple behaviors, and then we must employ more of the supportive framings and less of the catastrophe framings. We need better stories of where society is heading, greener growth, better well-being, rewilding of nature, and we also need signals to show how we are shifting the curve and not just perpetuating the old global warming signals from climate science going in the wrong direction. So very briefly, one example I love from each is the use of power, so using the power of social networks, showing that if this one house actually gets solar panels, the likelihood of these other houses, the neighboring houses, also getting solar panels are way, way higher. So, rooftop solar seems to be contagious, and we also can see that in Norway we have a pretty high penetration rate of electric cars. That if one person in the neighborhood gets an electric car, that quickly translates to the others down the road. A lot of work on social norms, how this kind of spreads as ripple in the water, and I can discuss that after my first intro here, if you want, in some level of depth. The second strategy is to combine the social norms and the social nudging with a behavioral nudge, in the sense of making it easier, simpler to do the right thing. So a few studies there, for instance, show that people tend to put more food on their plates the bigger it is. This one looks kind of empty, the one on the right-hand side here, to me. Hopefully it's on the right-hand side for you as well. This one looks full, it's the same amount of food. So, and people use this plate, they tend to fill it up with too much. They don't eat it all, and there's a lot of food waste. So by reducing the plate size, these studies show that food waste went down about 20%. Also, in terms of household appliances, if this is the purchase price, I will tend to buy the cheaper one of this tumbler dryer or the washing machines, even if this one is more expensive, but it's cheaper in the long run because it uses less power. Now, if I add to this the life cycle cost, so rather than the purchasing price, I see the life cycle cost, then people tend to choose the one that's cheaper over time, maybe even if that costs a little bit more today. Whether this is a car or tumbler dryer or other kind of household appliance, doesn't matter. So we shift behavior towards the climate-friendly one by making it easy to see which is the cheapest in the whole life cycle. So that's 2 examples from the simple or nudging approach. Then we have the supportive framings. So rather than 80% catastrophe, we need to speak more about the health impacts and the health benefits of climate mitigation, and the negative impacts of continued climate change in terms of pollen allergies, asthma, heat-related stresses, etc. So speaking about climate as a health issue is a major new approach that seems to be gathering traction all over the place, and studies have showed that it does generate more engagement with people than the catastrophe and other competing frames. Another very important frame is speak about climate mitigation as an insurance issue. We all have fire and theft insurance for our houses, but we don't have climate insurance, and we should have one. So it's also a good frame for speaking across the aisle. So just being prepared for what might come is a good frame. Finally, there are so many opportunities to speak about climate. We have smart devices, smart houses. Why can't we have smart roadways, such as the Solar Roadway project, which got a lot of enthusiasm because it has a positive framing to it. Even if economists don't like it, people support it because it's the kind of future they like to see. And there are all these kind of smart technologies, anything from Tesla, Google, or the electric bike area, that could contribute to having smarter, better societies that are also low emissions. Actually, I think climate change is one of the best opportunities to having people start collaborating internationally, because the air is something that afflicts us all and it connects us all. So the fourth is new stories we need to tell. So rather than the old, if we don't change now, we're going to burn in hell story, we need to tell stories of green growth, genuine green growth, and of course this comes in both high-tech and low-tech versions. We also need to talk about the better well-being in smarter cities, where we have the quality of life going up while the ecological footprint goes down. We also need to tell more about the story of stewardship to the earth. So like the Pope's encyclical last year was very important in getting out this is as a moral and value issue. And finally, I also like the rewilding story, that nature is incredibly resilient, and if we just give it a little help and work along with it, not against it, we will see a swerve in our relationship to nature, and also starting to mitigate climate change. Finally, I'd like to mention the signals strategy, which is that for decades now, climate scientists have been talking about ppms in the atmosphere, and also a lot of sea level rise in inches per decade and global surface average temperature per century. And of course, these are signals or indicators that people can't relate to. So we need personalized indicators, such as this one from a Norwegian bank, which shows your bank account statement along with your CO2 footprint from travels, food, car fuel, whatever you've been purchasing over the last month. And then you can see how that develops over time. And this should also be on the corporate level. This is a Norwegian company, which shows that they're creating less revenue for each $1 million of value added that they are making. So this seeing the relationship between value added and emissions is the carbon productivity is an important indicator on a corporate level and a city level, such as Copenhagen, which increased their value added while taking down their carbon emissions. So to sum this up, my introduction, are humans inevitably short-term? The question that's been driving me. And to a certain extent, the answer is yes. That is, if you base it all on rational facts, what we see that rational facts by themselves are insufficient to create lasting engagement. But humans will act for the long term if there are conducive conditions in place. And with these, we know that social norms, supportive frames, and simple actions, stories that create community and meaning, and signals that show we are actually making some progress, together these 5 conditions will make people act for the long term. There's good evidence for saying that. However, individual actions, of course, do not solve the climate problem as such, but what they can do is build bottom-up support for structural change, and that is why individual actions are incredibly important, because we do need this bottom-up support for more ambitious climate measures, so the politicians can do what they know is right and then be re-elected afterwards. That's why it's been put down for so long. They're afraid that if they really raise the prices of carbon, if they really strengthen the regulations, they might not get re-elected. But if there is public support, then democracy starts to work more for the long term. So with this, I'll hand the word back to Nelly, or whoever it was that's going to bring it forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Per Espen. I think actually your presentation, like your book, is actually such an important way to just kind of reorient our thinking around how to talk about climate change. And it's interesting. I was just in, I actually just came back about it last week from Jordan, where I was training environmental journalists in the Middle East on environmental issues. And what was striking was, and it goes to your graph, you know, you talk about climate change in the Middle East, and this happens to be one of the areas that's going through huge changes as a result of climate shifts. Nobody even has the question. The entire notion of reporting on environmental questions is told through the lens of climate change. So it's basically suffusing all the thinking, essentially, about the environmental conditions. Whereas here, here, of course, you've identified with this chart, and something we've experienced, this seeming resistance. The closer you get to those responsible, the higher the levels of resistance. So I just have a quick question, and I just want to send it over to Nelly and to everybody here. Hopefully you're all there and enjoyed this presentation. Hello. Just a quick, I found it very interesting that we've gone, you've been very strong at saying essentially we've gone away from this kind of religious notion of the climate battle, this idea that almost is very Lutheran, and, you know, with all respect to Lutherans, or, you know, anyway, a religious basis to our own guilt, which has been a struggle, you know, this notion that somehow we're all guilty, which of course we are, in a sense. We're all complicit in a sense, but we're all guilty with an exclamation point. And you seem to be moving away from that very powerfully. And I was wondering how you put that, shift that away to an economic argument. You have multiple facets to your discussion, but one was your discussion of life cycle questions, questions making the difference in people, how people decide. How do you tell that particular story as to explain the financial differences between a less climate destructive option versus another? And you can keep your answer fairly brief, because I know we have other people lined up here. Just curious.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mark, in saying that the climate messaging have been a lot of unconsciously Lutheran and even Calvinist, in the sense that we've been playing on people's fear and guilt. And what we know from psychology is that guilt and fear is deeply makes people passive, not engaging in the issue. So if we really want people to engage, guilt might trigger a few of the alarm, which is typically about 13% of the population, but the rest, the 85%, we don't really trigger with that extortion. So in terms of life cycle costs and the simple actions, we did some calculations just in the terms of the life cycle labeling of the household appliances. On average, it made customers buy appliances that were 5% more energy efficient, or with 5% reduction in CO2 emissions. And if applied to all EU countries, we calculate that would be about 10 million tons of CO2 just by shifting the labels on the machines, appliances in the store. Now that's a pretty strong effect of just reprinting the price labels. So our economic behavior is very influenced by the psychology of the decision-making architecture.
So
thank you. That's helpful. At some point, you might want to share what that label looks like, but we don't have to do that right now.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to just say hi. I'm Tara DePort. I'm the founder and executive director of the Human Impacts Institute, and I was able to make the call, so thank you so much for being here. We have a few questions from the audience, and I want to remind everyone, too, that you can submit a question if you go to the upper right-hand side of your window for this call. There's a grid that is directly to the right of the question mark that's in a circle, and if you click on that grid, you'll see Q&A, and you can submit a question there. So I wanted to thank you guys so much, and Per Espen, it's very exciting to hear your research, particularly because our whole organization is based on using inspiration and positivity and making environmental issues personal, so it's nice to hear that we're going in the right direction. I have a question from one of our partners out in California, from Alicia Escott, and she's really interested in hearing more on your thoughts around how action and behavior come before and drive attitude, and how this could frame identity. So I'm going to pass that over to either of you, but maybe Per Espen, do you want to start?
I can. As in the little slide I showed about the cognitive dissonance, we do know that there is a deep consistency between behavior and attitudes if these attitudes reflect deeply held values. So let's say you're vegetarian, then you typically, when you go to the when you go to the buffet or look at the menu, you choose the vegetarian options. So that's kind of easy to predict your actions based on your values and your attitudes. Also, if you're a very conservative voter or kind of hardcore Republican, it's easy to kind of predict your behavior when in the voting booth. So for quite a few deeply held values, there is a strong correlation between the attitude and the action. The interesting part is when there is dissonance here. So and also when there is no clear relationship between the value and the expressed action. In this case, all these kind of self-justifications come into play. And the moment we start with self-justifications, we have this need to make ourselves seem consistent. And then we come up with these excuses or these ideas that, okay, well, since I care about the climate, but it's kind of inconvenient for me to have this because my relatives are on the other coast, I need to fly. So, but now I installed solar panel of my roof, so my extra trip to New York doesn't really matter. When I started doing this, I typically will start to undermine my values, and when asked, I will tend to align my attitudes to my behaviors because I don't like to be perceived as somebody who's a hypocrite. I say something and do something else. And this is where action and behavior really drives a backlash on climate attitudes. But what I want to add at the end there is this can also be leveraged into something positive. So if people actually go biking because their friends do, or I save power because my neighbors do it, or I get a solar panel because that's kind of cool and I save money, well, if I do that, if I have an electric bike and I have a solar panel, then climate change must be important. So at this point, by giving people easy options, we flip it over so that this becomes a strength rather than a problem in terms of climate communications.
Great. And Mark, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
You know, I can't add a lot to what Per Espen said, other than I think what's interesting was in writing my book, I actually spent a lot of time talking to farmers, and they were kind of traditional farmers, not necessarily organic farmers who have, I think you could say, a high understanding of climate change, but these were some of the people in California's Central Valley, huge, big farms, all of which are experiencing very profound shifts in the temperature and water flow. And what was interesting was how vivid, when I spoke to them, they had a sense of the changing conditions were changing. Something was powerfully changing. Whether they could actually call it climate change or not was a different question. And my first instinct as a journalist was like, tell me, do you think this is climate change? And you know, they would go, I don't know what the hell it is, but something's changing. And suddenly I realized that they were the people who could talk about the experience and a response on that level without using the traditional kind of words that we need to have affirmed our own beliefs in a certain way. And of course, they would talk about experiences that the scientists are telling us over here are completely correlate to the experiences they're having on the ground. So that's just to add perhaps a little bit of an element to essentially how we approach this issue.
Great. I actually am going to follow up with a question I had, and then we'll go to a couple more of the audience ones, because I think it relates to just what you were talking about. I've heard a lot of different talks, particularly in the climate activism circle, of how much do we actually need to engage people in understanding climate change and climate science and getting on board with, particularly in the U.S., with not being deniers, etc. Versus how much do we focus on engaging people in the solutions. And I would love to hear, and it doesn't have to be a versus, but those are two options I put out there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this idea of where we put our energy and our time in terms of communications.
My response to that is that a lot of the climate facts have been tried to be communicated according to what's called the information deficit approach. And that is, climate scientists and communicators and activists have assumed that what people lack is the facts or more information to understand. And if only we could get that understanding out and into their brain, then it would kind of somehow filter through the layers, and then they would eventually agree with the consensus of the experts. And that's been proven wrong many times by now, both in the lab and field work and also in history. So we should leave the information deficit approach. That doesn't mean we shouldn't make the facts available, but we should rather create a communication situation in which people want to seek this out for themselves, so they get awaken the wish to learn more rather than telling what it is about. And I think solutions can be an excellent way of creating that curiosity. For instance, just as if in Oslo, for instance, there are some cool signals that are signs along the road that show how many people have biked here today. It doesn't tell anything about climate change. It doesn't talk about. It doesn't, it doesn't say anything about cars. It just shows with a big number. 2,300 people have biked past here today. When I bike myself, I see the number go up with 1. So I see myself having an impact. This kind of engaging people in solutions without explaining them to death how important the climate is, I think, the way forward. So how can we create a yearning, a wish for them to, because all the information is there. All they need is to go to any browser and they can find tons of information about climate change. A good one too, from all these public resources. But the question is, how do we trigger the yearning, the wish to learn? And we don't do that by pushing the facts too hard, I think. But engaging people in solutions is a fantastic way, I believe.
And Mark, I'm guessing as someone who's a journalist and works a lot in communications, that you might have an opinion on this as well?
Yes, I've thought about this a lot, just because my usual instincts going back some years have been to just basically find the quote villain in a situation and then kind of let it be to everybody else to figure out what to do about it. and I actually just have to say I'm evolving in this position, because I actually begin to see things differently. Number one, they're usually more complicated than are traditionally presented, and two, there is something about the tension underlying the shift, particularly in climate, that I think is important to capture, and that is quickly the notion that that essentially there is a kind of a battle going on, and if we acknowledge it, it's not just a battle against fossil fuel companies, the bad fossil fuel companies versus the good, the rest of us kind of thing. It's actually a battle to take the mechanisms of the economic order, and which have been favoring fossil fuels for all these years, and shifting them to actually favor a more long-term, sustainable, and economically viable model. And so that battle, and it is a battle, actually takes place on local levels, on national levels, state levels, And I think actually capturing that, and I don't mean just like battle, like there's the bad guy. It's actually identifying what in the economy can change and essentially who loses. I think some of the discussion around climate neglects the fact of kind of who is losing in this situation. There will be losers as we move in a green direction, and what are we going to do to accommodate the situation of those losers? I think with that kind of honesty, the movement itself can actually gain more traction because it's acknowledging that it's not like some, you know, that by acknowledging there are losers in this shift and what we're going to do about them, I think gives a lot more credibility to the struggle. That's a long answer too.
Well, I think we could have we might want to have an entire series on the role of the media in climate change. I think, Mark, we might get you again. So I have a question, and at first I want to ask Per Espen and Mark, because we had the technical difficulties at the beginning, are you willing to go a few minutes over the 1 o'clock? Like maybe 5 minutes past 1?
That's fine with me.
Mark?
Sure, no problem.
You good? Okay. So we have a question from Andrew Boyd. He posted 2. I'm going to go with this one first. And this is for you, Per Espen. Can you speak to how your excellent model works differently when you're trying to motivate collective or political behavior, not just individual or consumer behavior?
Yeah. What this brings up is, thanks for the question, Andrew. It's excellent, and it's actually something I've been looking into research more firmly into the future. There's a negative side to this, which is that democracy doesn't always, or quite often as not, reflect the main intentions of the majority. And the reason for this is, of course, the interest groups and the way they influence the political process. However, when politicians and parties seek what kind of messages they should propose, they look closely at polls. And if the climate comes out as 14 out of 15th consistently, we tend to not get much talk on the democracy level of collective solutions. So by having people doing individual actions and then seeing that others are doing it and working through social norms, all this creates a mainly invisible bottom-up swell that might take a lot of time to actually effectuate, but it is, according to many sociologists and social anthropologists, the way that cultures have been overturned earlier. I'm talking about overturning the cultural denialism, such as was in the apartheid in South Africa, or the fall of the Berlin Wall with the communist countries, and the Vietnam War in the US. That in the beginning, it seems that all these individual actions, all these gradual work to help shift the social norms through non-NGOs, communities, it's ineffectual. It doesn't really come through. And then at some point there is this non-linear change in a culture where the denial pattern shift, and then it seems to come out of nowhere. And of course, the latest example in the US is the equal right to marriage, gay right. That happened just a few years ago. 10 years ago, it was nobody, and then it just kind of shifted. So in the same way, if we keep working on individual actions while acknowledging it's not sufficient in itself to solve the climate problem, but individual actions as a cultural change, then we can rely on evidence that this is the way it's happened before. Even if we cannot predict exactly at what point in time it would be sufficient to shift the climate denial.
Great. Mark, do you have any additions to that or follow-ups?
First of all, it's like really interesting. I would just add maybe one quick thing. Is I had this talk, and most of you will probably know the writer Adam Hochschild, who actually wrote a book called Bury the Change, which was the history of the the abolition movement to abolish slavery. One of the most interesting things he said, in addition to it being just a masterpiece of a book, was that the abolitionist movement was the first example of a movement based on global altruism and sort of empathy for people with whom we had nothing else in common. So, and it has its roots in Britain, of course, the abolition movement, which ultimately came to America, but it started as a kind of a movement to abolish the slave trade, and did slowly become a global movement back in the 18th century. Not quick enough, needless to say, but anyway. What was interesting is he's been, was talking about this in the correlation of the climate context, and how essentially the idea of empathy is beginning to kind of be built into the way that climate is reported and considered when we talk about the situation of people in distant places that we don't live in. And obviously this is starting to play out now with the refugee situation too. But I thought that was an interesting way to understand it. And I think that there is also a change that's happening now, in addition to what he said, which is that now people are experiencing climate change themselves directly in the kind of rich countries, which is actually starting to even change even the notion of kind of a distant empathy. But I would just make those two comments, I think. One, about the evolution of empathy, and two, essentially how that may even be changing now as all of us are more impacted directly by climate change.
Great. Well, are there any, we have a couple more questions on there, but we are going to run out of time, and I want to also pitch our next Impacts Hours for next month, which for people who are watching now is actually going to be around looking at the U.S. politics and climate change and communications. And I'll pitch that in a minute. I'm just giving you a teaser. But before I get there, Per Espen and Mark, are there any other things that you would like to comment on before we close?
I'm going to let Per Espen have the final word here. Thank you for putting this together.
Yeah, the final words. I think one of the interesting things coming from the psychology and the intersection between psychology and sociology and political science work now is to look at how we can work within the democratic frame of 4-year periods to address the long term, or at least get some shifts even within these 4 years. So one study, for instance, looked at the history of the smoking ban, indoor smoking ban, as well as the rush hour traffic pricing in Stockholm, and the British Columbia example of the carbon tax that reduces your income tax. And all these 4 came against the attitudes of the public in general. So the majority was actually against all these 3. And then it was pushed through anyway, and by weathering the storm, so to speak, when you shift these individual behaviors by regulation or some political courage, then as behavior shifts, then the support shift as well. So after the regulation of smoking ban, after the rush hour traffic, and after the carbon tax pricing, people supported it more than they did before. And this is the kind of evidence or experiments we need to document so we can push that further. So I think it addresses a weakness in the democratic system, that short-term policies tend to win out over the long term. But if we can do that, there still seems to be quite a bit of room even within the 4-year periods. So this to me is one of the, and then combining that with economic measures is the way forward, I think, for this area of combining research with the activism.
Great. Well, I want to, Mark, did you have something? You look like you look very thoughtful.
Yes. Well, first of all, I just appreciate how Per Espen approaches the questions of narrative and how we respond to those narratives. So, and so, but I would also just add one thing, not to forget quickly, that we did have a Paris climate accord back in December, and although it's been 6 long months since December, it's still a very live factor when we think about climate change. And the only reason I just want to throw a word or two out about it is that it created an unprecedented kind of, it may have not been as quick, and we can go, you can criticize it from here to tomorrow, but what it did accomplish was it created an unprecedented, essentially global structure for moving the world towards the reduction of fossil fuels on a steady basis. And there's going to be a continuous check-in process as we kind of begin to assess how every single country can begin to reduce those fuels. And it cannot be underestimated either China's deep engagement with this process. So you can no longer, the United States, by the way, can no longer accuse China, you're not doing anything, so we won't, nor can the Chinese accuse the United States any longer of doing the same thing. So we've broken that kind of kabuki dance. And I think sort of looking at it on a global scale, that there actually is action kind of moving forward, coming out of that accord, just to tip our hats to that.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, all of us on the call are working hard to keeping that momentum and building that momentum from that as well. And I really want to thank both of you for being our guinea pigs on our first Google Hangout on air. We had relatively few hitches. And really thank you for your work, and this conversation was really interesting. I hope that this is a start of future collaborations. And I do want to let everyone know that I think, just apropos to particularly here in the US, the election year, presidential election year, our next guest is on July 28th. At the same time at noon Eastern time in the US, 9 a.m. for those on the West Coast, and then for you, Per Espen, I guess that's 6 p.m. Over there, and that will be with, we'll be looking at public opinion on climate change in the US, and particularly also looking at the political system with Tony Lazarowitz, who is at Yale, the Senior Research Center scientist at Yale University at the School of Forestry, and who's also the head of the program on climate change communications. So I hope you guys can...
A good friend of mine. So
I figured.
Absolutely join. Tony is terrific.
Yes. Well, hopefully, maybe you can join us for that too if you're available. It'd be lovely.
Send me an invitation. Yeah.
I will. Thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao. Morning.